February 28, 2025. Washington, D.C. Volodymyr Zelensky enters the White House. He walks in as a celebrated wartime leader. Over 40 nations have publicly backed his fight. NATO has pledged its full structural weight behind Ukraine. The United States alone has transferred more than $100 billion into his country's survival. Patriot air defense batteries, HIMARS rocket systems, Javelin anti-tank missiles by the thousands. At this moment, Zelensky is arguably the most recognized wartime figure on the planet, the man who refused to flee when the world expected him to run. He is here to lock in continued American support and sign a landmark minerals partnership agreement. He believes this meeting is a formality. What he doesn't know is that he has approximately 45 minutes before the most powerful alliance of his life begins to permanently collapse. The relationship between Zelensky and Washington had been built on a foundation of mutual necessity. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, the United States made a calculated decision. It would arm Ukraine. It would fund Ukraine. It would supply the intelligence, the missiles, and the air defense architecture that kept the country alive. Patriot interceptors, ATACMS long-range strike missiles, guided MLRS rockets. These were not just weapons, they were the scaffolding of Ukrainian survival. Every single one required American authorization to deploy. That dependency was total. Ukraine could not fight its war without Washington's active participation, and Washington knew it. For nearly 3 years, the arrangement held. Weapons moved east. Aid packages passed through Congress. Zelensky stood before a joint session of the United States Congress and received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. European allies lined up in lockstep behind American leadership. The picture presented to the world was one of ironclad Western solidarity. It was deliberately constructed. It was also fragile beneath the surface. American patience was quietly eroding. New political calculations were forming behind closed doors. When the Trump administration returned to power in January 2025, those calculations shifted with immediate and dramatic force. Donald Trump had signaled his impatience with what he called an endless war. His team had spent months engaging Russian counterparts through back channels. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, was shuttling between Washington and Moscow with increasing regularity. His Russian counterpart was Kirill Dmitriev, a close confidant of Vladimir Putin. These conversations were happening without Kiev in the room. Ukraine was not consulted. It was not reliably informed. Zelensky was learning about developments in his own country's future the same way the general public was. Through press leaks, through second-hand briefings, through fragments of diplomatic cables that reached him days after the fact. The nature of these back-channel discussions had remained deliberately opaque to the Ukrainian government. Witkoff's Moscow visits were officially framed as exploratory diplomatic missions with no predetermined outcome. In reality, detailed proposals were being exchanged and refined across multiple sessions. American officials were signaling flexibility on territorial questions that had previously been non-negotiable red lines. The message being conveyed to Russia was unmistakable. The United States was prepared to negotiate an end state that did not require Ukrainian territorial restoration. These talks operated in a kind of diplomatic shadow space, where American leverage over Russia was being tested and measured against American willingness to pressure Ukraine. Zelensky's intelligence services were receiving fragments of intelligence about these meetings, but nothing that conveyed the full scope of what was actually being discussed. Then came the document that defined everything. Witkoff and Dmitriev jointly produced a 28-point framework for ending the war. The terms were staggering. Crimea would formally become Russian territory. Luhansk and Donetsk would be ceded permanently. The Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions would remain under Russian military control indefinitely. Ukraine would be permanently barred from NATO membership. The Ukrainian military would be capped at a maximum of 600,000 troops in perpetuity. The plan ratified every major Russian territorial demand from before the invasion. Ukrainian officials called it a capitulation immediately. Bohdan Krotovich, former commander of the Azov Brigade, stated that the military reduction clause alone amounted to national surrender. No serious Ukrainian official disagreed. The international response to the framework's leak was swift and fractured. NATO's Eastern European members issued a joint statement, warning that the proposed territorial cessions would destabilize the entire region for decades. The Baltic states, who had already called for accelerated defense spending, declared that any agreement excluding Ukrainian consent would represent an unprecedented violation of basic principles of sovereignty. France's position was more measured, but fundamentally skeptical. Germany's new defense minister warned that abandoning Ukraine would force Eastern Europe to pursue independent nuclear deterrence programs. British officials questioned privately whether the framework had any realistic path to Russian acceptance or sustainable implementation. The February 28th meeting was supposed to be a formality. Zelensky arrived at the White House expecting a substantive working session. The Minerals Partnership Agreement had been drafted. Both governments had agreed in principle to sign it. The deal was meant to deepen the strategic relationship between Washington and Kyiv and formalize economic cooperation going forward. It represented something concrete, something binding, an American commitment with legal teeth. Instead, the meeting collapsed into open confrontation within minutes of the cameras switching on. Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance went on the offensive with barely any preamble. They questioned Ukraine's capacity to manage the war. They challenged Zelensky's strategic decisions at the front. Trump pointed to what he described as Zelensky's intense hatred toward Putin, declaring it made deal-making impossible. He told the assembled press, "You see the hatred he's got for Putin? It's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate." Vance accused Zelensky of ingratitude. Not once during the entire exchange did either man criticize Vladimir Putin for launching the largest European land invasion since World War II. Zelensky pushed back. The atmosphere turned openly hostile. The Ukrainian delegation walked out of the White House with the minerals agreement still unsigned. The footage reached Ukraine within hours. The reaction was visceral and immediate. Ukrainians had spent 3 years watching their soldiers die on frozen front lines. Hundreds of thousands had been killed or severely wounded. Entire cities had been shelled into blackened rubble. The country had absorbed wave after wave of devastating drone and missile strikes against civilian power infrastructure, hospitals, and water treatment facilities. They had endured all of it under the explicit belief that their Western allies stood firmly behind them. What they watched on their screens that February afternoon looked nothing like the solidarity they had been promised. 3 days later, Trump made his next calculated move. On March 3rd, 2025, the White House halted all deliveries of American military assistance to Ukraine. The freeze affected roughly $1 billion worth of arms and ammunition. It also suspended intelligence sharing between Washington and Kyiv. This was not an administrative error. It was leverage, precisely designed and deliberately applied. Ukraine's air defense system depended on American-supplied Patriot interceptors that no European nation could provide at scale. Its long-range strike capability relied entirely on ATACMS and GMLRS systems that required direct American authorization to fire. The message from Washington was clinical: comply with American diplomatic preferences or bleed for them. The mechanism worked exactly as designed. Russian forces, now aware of the intelligence gap, accelerated their push in the Kursk region. Ukrainian positions that had held for months began to buckle. Soldiers died in engagements that functioning intelligence sharing might have prevented entirely. Facing genuine battlefield collapse, and the prospect of further territorial losses, Zelensky accepted a 30-day ceasefire framework on American terms. The minerals deal was eventually signed in a significantly weakened form under conditions of duress. Ukraine got its aid restored. It also received an unambiguous lesson in how conditional that aid had always been. Trump, once Ukraine complied, declared the fate of the ceasefire was now up to Russia and dispatched Witkoff directly to Moscow to meet with Putin. On the domestic front, the pressure came from a second direction entirely. A corruption scandal tore through Zelensky's inner circle during the same period. Former business associates and political allies were formally implicated in a scheme involving Ukraine's state nuclear energy monopoly. Anti-corruption agencies launched independent investigations. Zelensky initially moved to curtail their operational independence, a decision that triggered mass street protests in cities across Ukraine. He reversed course within weeks. The damage had been done regardless. His approval rating, which had stood near 90% in the early months of the full-scale invasion, had collapsed to a far more contested number. A December survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology found 32% of the population no longer trusted him. The Europeans moved with unusual speed. Within 12 hours of the Oval Office disaster, Zelensky was in London, meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. By March 2nd, 18 European leaders had gathered alongside NATO's Secretary-General and the President of the European Council. 6 days after that, the European Union convened an emergency summit. The bloc agreed to mobilise up to €800 billion for collective defence spending. The Rearm Europe initiative placed €150 billion in direct loan financing on the table. Fiscal rules across member states were loosened to unlock an additional €600 billion in national defence budgets. Europe was rearming at a pace not seen since the Cold War. The continent was terrified, and its fear was well-founded. The acceleration of European military spending represented more than just economic mobilization. It signaled a fundamental shift in how the continent viewed its strategic autonomy. For 7 decades, European security had been underwritten by the American nuclear umbrella and conventional force projection. That assumption was now openly questioned in policy circles from Helsinki to Lisbon. Military planners across NATO's eastern flank were running worst-case scenarios that assumed American disengagement from European security commitments extending far beyond Ukraine. The European move toward independent defence capability was being driven not by confidence in collective European military capacity, but by the terrifying recognition that such capacity could no longer be assumed to rest on American guarantees. Poland accelerated its tank procurement programs by 18 months. Romania and Bulgaria expanded their Black Sea naval presence. Germany authorized emergency defense spending that broke with 75 years of post-war fiscal orthodoxy. But European support, however historically significant, could not immediately replace what Washington was withdrawing. The critical capabilities keeping Ukraine in the fight were American by design and American by supply chain, Patriot interceptor ammunition, real-time satellite targeting data, classified signals intelligence. European nations did not manufacture these systems at sufficient scale to bridge the gap quickly. The transition would require years. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces were rationing artillery shells and conducting controlled withdrawals from exposed frontline positions. The gap between what Europe could provide immediately and what Ukraine needed today was measured not in euros but in casualties. Zelensky himself was changing under the weight of it. The man who had stood before cameras in Kiev's streets in the first hours of the invasion, dressed in military green, refusing evacuation, now found himself fighting on an entirely different kind of front. Not just against Russian armor and missiles, against the diplomatic machinery of his own supposed partners. He began building new relationships from scratch. He toured the Middle East. He offered Ukraine's hard-earned battlefield expertise, its drone operators, its electronic warfare specialists, its targeting analysts, to nations watching the broader regional conflict with wary and calculating eyes. Ukraine had become an exporter of survival knowledge because it had no alternative. Back inside Ukraine, his political opponents were organizing. Under peacetime conditions, the pressure would have been manageable, but the war was grinding forward without pause. The army was taking catastrophic losses along multiple axes simultaneously. Desertions were climbing. Recruitment was failing to keep pace with attrition. Opposition lawmakers warned publicly that accepting the Witkoff-Dmitriev framework would not end the conflict. It would pause it. Russia would rearm, reconsolidate along shortened defensive lines, and strike again from a position of permanent territorial advantage. Inna Sovsun of the Holos opposition party stated it plainly. The price for maintaining dialogue with Washington could not be the sovereignty of Ukraine itself. In Geneva, negotiators from the United States, Ukraine, and European powers gathered to work through the revised 28-point document under the supervision of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, represented Ukraine across the table. American officials coordinated directly and openly with Putin's chosen envoy. The composition of the room told the story more clearly than any statement could. Ukraine was not a principal in the negotiation. It was the subject of it. The territorial lines being drawn on maps in that Swiss conference hall would determine Ukrainian sovereignty for generations. And the men doing the drawing were treating Russian agreement as the binding constraint, not Ukrainian consent. The talks were moving forward. A decision was approaching. And somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, a massive American naval force was already repositioning for what intelligence analysts were calling the largest US naval battle since the Gulf War.